All right. Hello again, adventurers, and welcome to another exciting, in-depth preview. For those of you wondering why the hesitation, I am going to be reviewing kind of the new Daggerheart 1.2 playtest. However, because Daggerheart in and of itself, they're calling this a beta. I hate the term beta. It's a video game term. It doesn't belong in tabletop games. This is a playtest. Because Daggerheart is not scheduled to be released until 2025, so we probably have well over a year before we're going to see the final version of it. The version that I'm going to be doing the review of isn't technically a full game or even a completed game. This is just the playtest material. Now, it does have basically everything you need to run a campaign from 1 to 10, which is the full gamut of levels in this game. It's got most of the stuff you need to be able to modify things, and it's got a bestiary, and there's a quick start adventure. So there's a lot here, but this is not a full system. It's also 100% free. So that means calling this an in-depth review doesn't really work. So we're going to call this an in-depth preview and kind of go from there. Now, if you enjoy content like this, please remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell icon to turn notifications on. All those things are super important. Now, when I say in-depth, I mean in-depth. I am going to talk about the things that I like, the things that I don't like, the things I think they do well, the things I think they need to do better. And I will sometimes go chapter by chapter, page by page. But a lot of people don't really want to sit through like an hour and a half or 2 hour long video just to figure out if this is something that they want to pick up. Because this is a preview rather than a review, instead, I normally start off with a should you buy it section. Instead of a should you buy it section, I am going to start off with a what to expect section for the 3 different groups of people that might be interested in this. The first group is players. These are people that are primarily, not exclusively, but primarily going to be sitting at a table and playing a single character. They're going to have different wants and needs than the other 2 groups, obviously. The second group, it's going to be GMs. These are people that are primarily, not exclusively, but primarily going to be sitting in the GM seat. And they're going to be helping create the world. They're going to be running the monsters, doing your normal GM roles. And then the third, normally pretty overlooked group, is what I call Lorehounds. Lorehounds may never actually sit down at a table to play, but they're really interested in the setting and the lore and the history of the world that the game takes up. So I am going, instead of giving you a recommendation of whether or not you should buy it or not, because again, it's free, I'm going to give kind of an idea of the stuff that you might experience if you were to pick this up, to give you a better idea of whether or not you feel that this is a kind of game that you'd be interested. So, what can you expect? Well, let's look into that. The first group. What should players expect? So, Daggerheart in and of itself is fascinating, for lack of a better term. In the very beginning of the book, on page 8, actually, of the playtest manuscript, they have a section called Touchstones. And it's basically all the different things that inspired Daggerheart. And I'm actually going to read off the list here, because I don't think this is... Well, none of this stuff is secret anymore. It all exists now. But specifically, after the Touchstone section, there's a kind of subsection called Special Appreciation. And we're actually when I do the in-depth part of the review, I'm actually going to go through every single one of those things because it really defines how the game is played, because these are the things that influence different aspects of the game mechanically and things like that. So the touchstones for a player, if you enjoy games like 13th Age, Apocalypse World, Blades in the Dark, Masks, Shadowrun, Dungeons and Dragons, the Cypher system, Genesis. These are all different tabletop RPGs that Daggerheart takes some inspiration from. And some of them, they take really, really large parts. I'm going to give you guys, I'm going to pull the Band-Aid off right now. D&D 4th Edition, there are some major aspects of D&D 4th Edition that show up in this game, and it makes me very, very happy. Probably my favorite of which we will talk about in the GM section. But, so if you are going to be playing this as a player, the things that you should expect, first of all, you're going to be rolling 2d12 for all of your kind of ability checks and the things like that. And one of your d12 is going to be called the Hope Die. Whatever, excuse me. And one of your d12s are going to be called the Fear Die. And basically, when you roll, you're going to be trying to hit a difficulty class, just like any other thing. So maybe you need to roll a 12 or higher. And depending on which one of those dice rolls higher, you will either succeed with fear, succeed with hope, or fail with hope, fail with fear. And the hope-fear mechanic is really what makes this kind of a really interesting thing for players. Players are going to have a resource called hope that you can stack up to 5 of them, and you can use hope for a bunch of different things. You can burn a point of hope to add an experience to a roll, to basically to add an additional modifier to a roll based on the background of your character. There's certain abilities that require you to burn hope. There's actually a lot of different ways that you can use as hope. But basically, hope is a positive player-owned resource. And a lot of times when you roll with hope, you can earn more hope through a bunch of different things. On the exact other side, you have fear, and fear is basically bad stuff. The GM actually collects fear in the form of, I guess you could call it fear tokens or fear points or something like that. But he has a pool of fear that he can use for very akin to the Cypher system intrusion system, which I really, really love, and it's an essential part of playing the Cypher system well, is using these intrusions to make the game more interesting and fun. So the fear system, basically you roll poorly, or you roll well, but your fear die is higher, is going to give the GM the opportunity to interact with this as a story in a way that makes things more complicated for the characters. So that's kind of the main mechanic that you're going to be dealing with, is this hope and fear system. There's a few other things. They have an advantage-disadvantage system that's very different from other systems that I've seen before. Advantage, you roll a d6 and take and add it to your score. At disadvantage, you roll a d6 and you subtract it from your score. So a little bit different, but still kind of the same basic principle of it's going to modify a little bit of your roll. A little less of probability manipulation and more of just a non-static bonus or did a detriment to your rolls. As far as building characters in it, it is a class-based system, but each character, very akin to D&D 4th Edition, each character comes with a number of abilities divided up into a bunch of different kind of categories. You have your subclass ability, you have your racial ability, you choose a race and it comes with ability, you have your, what were they called? So you have an ancestry ability, which is your race, you have a community ability, and then you have your class. And each class gets access to basically a deck By the way, card-based character creation, kind of interesting, gets gets access to two different decks of abilities that they can effectively mix and match. Um, the decks are split into these things called domains, and each class is going to share a domain with another class. So it's possible that you are going to have some access to some of the same abilities as some other players, and when that happens, they highly recommend that you kind of talk with the other player and figure it out. So again, very akin to D&D for 4th edition. When you create your character, you automatically get your ancestry ability, which is a card. You automatically get your community ability, which is a card. And then when you pick your class, you get to choose a subclass, which again gives you another ability. And then you get to pick 2 of 6 domain cards. There's 3 in each domain currently. Again, when the game launches, they may have more of all these things. We don't know. This is, again, just a play test. But you choose 2 of 6 of the available domain cards, and all of that stuff goes into what your character can do. And again, it makes for very interesting characters. Another thing that's kind of unique about this, there is quote-unquote weapon proficiency in the game, but it doesn't work the way that you think it does. For players, you will have a proficiency score. It starts at 1. I think it can get up to a maximum of 6 as you level up. And what that means is when you use a weapon to do damage, each weapon has a damage die. You roll the number of damage dice times your proficiency. So if you have a proficiency of 3 and you're using, let's say, arcane gauntlets, which do a d10 plus 2 damage. According to my understanding of the system, feel free to correct me if I'm wrong somewhere, with a proficiency of 3, you would roll 3d10 plus 6 damage if you hit. So the same weapon that you're using at first level just gets more powerful as you go up in the levels. It doesn't mean there aren't higher level weapons that do even more cool things, but it does mean that you are not limited to having to kind of constantly upgrade your weapons like you would be in something like D&D the 3rd edition, where if you're not constantly getting higher level magic weapons, you're eventually not going to be able to hit the targets. So that in and of itself I thought was really interesting. There's the damage system is really interesting. Again, I'll go into more specific details when I get to that section in the in-depth preview portion. But effectively, you have hit points and stress, and they work in kind of different ways. Like, hit points are exactly what you think, but you have a single-digit number of hit points. Like, you'll start with like 5 hit points or something, but characters will do 7, 10, 12 points of damage. So the way that they deal with this is you have these wound thresholds where, like, for a character, you have minor. What are they? Let me go to a character sheet real quick, and it makes it a little bit easier here. So you have 3 damage thresholds: minor, major, and severe. And basically, if you take any damage below your minor threshold, you actually don't take any hit point damage. You'll mark a stress point. However, once you get to your minor damage threshold, you will take 1 hit point of damage. If it gets up to your major damage threshold, you take 2 points of damage. Gets to your severe damage threshold, you take 3 points of damage. So for like a bard, their damage threshold starts at minor is 3, major is 8, severe is 13. So if they get hit by an attack and it does 4 points of damage, they take 1 hit point of damage. However, if it does 10 points of damage, they would take 2. If it does 20 points of damage, they would take 3. And there's some optional rules about if it does a lot more damage, maybe you take more hit points. But And then anything under 3, they would just mark as stress. Stress is also used for a number of other things. There are abilities that you'll have built into your class that you burn as stress to be able to use. In a situation where you maybe succeed with fear, one of the consequences of that might be that you have to mark as stress because of something going wrong. Or there are some situations where the GM might say, well, if you want to avoid this bad situation, mark a stress or mark 2 stress or something like that. If you run out of stress, anytime you are supposed to mark a stress, you mark a hit point instead. And if you run out of hit points, your character dies. We'll talk about player death when we get to that point, but it is interesting to say the least. To sum it up really, really quickly, Resurrection is not going to work like it does in D&D, where after you get to about 5th level, death is kind of a mild inconvenience. Especially when you get to high levels where you're unkillable as long as you can have at least one person not drop to 0 hit points. You can always revivify and resurrect and all that stuff. It doesn't quite work that way in Daggerheart. Death is a little bit more permanent, and players do have a little bit more control over when they die and how. But it's an interesting class mechanic. So Daggerheart in and of itself is a very combat-focused game. Most of your abilities are going to be geared more towards combat than anything else. It doesn't mean that there isn't a lot of role-playing and interesting stuff in there, but it pitches itself as a more combat-oriented tabletop RPG. So as a player, if that's what you're interested in a game, it's not particularly crunchy. There's not a ton of math involved, and you're not going to be sitting there and min-maxing your character into oblivion. It is a very rules-light but very combat-oriented, or more combat-oriented game. So if those are the things that appeal to you, maybe look into the Daggerheart. And if that's not something that appeals to you, maybe wait for the next playtest, because this is the current version of it. We don't know what it's going to be like by the next playtest, or especially by the time it actually fully releases. So, yeah, moving on. The second group. What should GMs expect from Daggerheart? So, again, there's a lot of things in Daggerheart that remind me of other systems because they were inspired by other systems. I mentioned before the Cypher system intrusion mechanic. It was probably one of the more difficult things I had to learn when I was learning how to run the Cypher system is intrusions are basically in the middle of a roll or just before a player's about to roll. You go, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to make this roll a little bit harder by adding in this little tweak. And in base Cypher system, excuse me, the way that it happens is you do this intrusion and you give that player 1 experience point, and they can give another player 1 experience point. And so it's actually beneficial to players for you to do these intrusions, because experience points are used for everything in the Cypher system. You could use them to block intrusions. You use them, obviously, to level up. You can use them to create good situations for your character. Like, there's a lot of different things. And so it feels, the first time you do it, it feels like a very adversarial thing, and it's not. It's giving the characters the chance to succeed on an even more difficult thing. And it's adding complications and conflict to this story. When you are GMing Daggerheart, when you're GMing Daggerheart, you're going to be dealing with similar things, where as the players roll with fear and fail in things like that, you are going to be gaining fear. And you need to use that on a regular basis to challenge the characters, to challenge the party. The advice that they give in the playtest manuscript itself is constantly referencing the idea that you really shouldn't be storing up your hope and fear forever. You should be constantly burning through them. That's how the game is designed to be run. Another thing that they make a large emphasis of in here for GMs is watch how often you make your characters roll. Every time a character rolls, there is a chance to gain either fear or hope. And when that happens, again, hope is beneficial for the player. Fear is beneficial for the GM. If you are making them roll constantly, you are basically going to flood the game with a limited resource. You're going to make a limited resource unlimited. And that's going to unbalance the game pretty drastically. So an example that they give in here, if a rogue is going to pick a mundane lock, in any other RPG, you'd go, okay, roll Thieves' Tools or roll a dexterity check or something like that. In this, they're a rogue whose background involves them breaking into places. They're going to be able to pick a lock. So you don't actually need to have them make that roll. You can just go, okay, you do it. Let's move the story forward. The only time you want them to be making rolls is when the results of that roll are going to make the story more interesting. Whether it's success or failure, you want every single time that they roll to move the story forward. Very, very similar to the adage from Open Legend, every roll matters. The same thing is here. If you're making them roll, understand it's possibly going to either build your resources or the player's resources. And it needs to be something that if they fail, something interesting is going to happen. And if they succeed, something interesting is going to happen. If they succeed with hope, something really interesting is going to happen that's beneficial to them. If they succeed with fear, something interesting is going to happen that may have some unintended consequences. If they fail with hope, something is going to move the story forward despite the fact that they didn't get what they want, and there's going to be something cool that happens to the characters despite the fact that it didn't work the way they wanted. And if they fail with fear, then they're not going to get what they want, and something bad is going to happen. So you really do want to be kind of focusing on when you're having them roll. It needs to be something that does something. Now that doesn't mean that anytime a rogue tries to pick a lock that they just auto succeed. However, in a situation where there's really no limitations, there's no reason for them to worry about the lock not getting picked. There's no reason to make them roll. However, if you want to add something to it, well, yeah, I want to go ahead and pick this lock, and there is a security patrol that's coming around randomly. Well, now there's something at stake. Maybe the additional stress of you have to do this now and you have to do it very quietly is going to make it more difficult. If they fail, there's a lot of different things that could happen. You know, if you fail picking a lock and there's no security, there's nothing around, then you just try it again, or you break the lock. There's really not a whole lot of excitement. But if you fail at something, and let's say the security is coming, well, it could mean you fail with hope. Well, you're doing it, and you try it, and then you hear this, oh shoot, my lockpick is jammed in the lock. There's absolutely no way I'm going to be able to do this before the security patrol gets around. What do you guys want to do? You fail with hope. They get a little bit of time to figure out, okay, we need to do something else. We need to hide. We need to do something. Fail with fear. You just sit there and you go, and suddenly you feel a tap on your shoulder and you go, hey, I'm almost there. And then you feel the tap again. You're like, what? You look up and there's a guard with a halberd pointed at all of your friends. Oh no. The same thing is true about, succeed with hope. You are able to do it. Not only are you able to get through the door, you're able to close it and lock it back again so that as a security patrol comes around, nobody's the wiser you're ever there. Fail with fear. You get through, you go through, but the security patrol eventually comes over, realizes someone has broken in, and sounds an alarm. So see, those are the kind of interesting things that you need to be doing with a system like Daggerheart. In addition to kind of rolling in the fear and everything like that, they bring back one of my favorite things ever. Enemies have categories. Now, what do you mean by that? I mean, enemies have categories. I'm going to see if I can find the whole list here real quick. Where is it? Part 2. Is it in part 2? Core mechanics. Picking up equipment loot. Part 3. Running adventure. Core. Standard Skulk. I know that this exists here. Again, with this being a brand new system, there's like their index is not particularly great just yet, and other stuff like that. Where did you go? Anyway, I'm not going to look it up right now, but basically, if you go back to 4th edition, again, my personal favorite edition of D&D, I think it was fantastic. You go back to 4th edition, there were categories of monsters. Like you had solo monsters and brutes and things like that, and each one basically meant that the monster kind of filled a different role on the battlefield. Those are in Daggerheart, and what it means is when you are building encounters and things like that, you have a lot more tools at your disposal to create interesting encounters. Like, instead of just going, okay, I'm going to put a bunch of dogs in there, and then I'm also going to put some guards to kind of be the dog handlers. You can go, well, I'm going to have this creature be a brute, and he's going to be, really tough and difficult for them, and he's going to be in the front line. Then I'm going to have 2 skulkers around that are just kind of dash in and out of combat and kind of sneak around and attack from the sides. Then we're going to have these ranged ones back here, and each different category does different things and makes it that much easier for you to understand, okay, if I mix and match these things, they're going to work well together, they're going to synergize with each other. It is an essential part of good combat design, is to have more than just, hey, here are 5 versions of the exact same creature that you have to kill one by one. That's boring in encounter design. Something that I use a lot of because I'm not great at encounter design, and I'm really, really thrilled that they're bringing that back, because building encounters in D&D 4th edition was not only relatively simple compared to how it is in 5th edition, it was fun to do. And I definitely see that in here. In addition to that, a lot of GMing in Daggerheart is going to be a conversation rather than a dictation. And what I mean by that, in a lot of other systems, and I think D&D 5th edition has started to become, or I think D&D in general has always kind of had this thing of you are dictated the situation by the dungeon master, and then you react to their dictation. They will tell you what to roll, when to roll, things like that. In Daggerheart, it's much more of a conversation. The GM will ask you what you want to do. You'll describe what you want to do, and then the GM may ask for a roll, but they won't always ask for a particular attribute to be used. Or in this case, I think they call them traits in Daggerheart. They might say, hey, you go, I want to kind of climb over this and do this and do that. And he goes, okay. I think that might be a strength roll. What do you think? Or, okay, yeah, I'm going to make that. I'm going to make that a difficulty 15 roll. What do you think you're going to use for that? There's much more of a conversational aspect, which again takes a lot of inspiration from the things like Apocalypse World and Powered by the Apocalypse games. It has always been kind of a very much conversational. That's the kind of GMing that you're going to be doing here. Even with building the world, they kind of encourage the players to be a part of that. Somewhere in here, I can't remember where, they do have a section that specifically says you are all storytellers, not just the GM. So the players should have input on the world as well. So very much a collaborative style tabletop RPGs compared to other ones where it's significantly more accepted that the GM's role is to create the world and tell the players what to do, and then the players react to that. So yeah. As far as maps and minis and things like that, they do not. They don't really recommend doing things on a grid or anything. It's designed to be rules light. They do. Have recommendations on how to use maps and stuff like that, and effectively what they have you do is, like, you don't need a grid, and you should use kind of approximate distances. Like, all the distances in this are like close, very close, melee, long, things like that, to make it easier to kind of fudge the numbers and just go, yeah, that looks like you're roughly within a short range or a medium range. So it's not supposed to be the hyper tactical thing that you would get in Pathfinder or D&D 5th edition or 4th edition for that matter. But maps can be a very useful tool for the players to help them kind of guide how they want to play their characters, even without having a grid on there and using it specifically. Now, does that mean that you can't use a grid for this? No, they do actually have particular distances labeled for each of the different distance names. Like, very close is within 5 to 10 feet. Melee is right next to you. Things like that. So you could use this on a grid. But the recommendation from here is don't use gridded combat. Let it be a little bit more. If you've ever played any kind of miniature war game, they basically, their distance is generally measured in inches, where you literally take a ruler, put it at the base of your unit, and then move it until the front of the unit is at the 5-inch mark or the 4-inch mark. And it just gives you a little bit more freedom to kind of move any direction you want and go to anywhere. Like, if there's an area that on a gridded map, it would be in between two different squares, where who's standing where is it? Without the squares, you get that little bit more freedom. And that kind of describes Daggerheart as a whole, is this idea of they give you enough rules to fudge the numbers. The narrative is supposed to be first in this game. All the rules here are intentionally vague so that they can be interpreted a few different ways, whatever serves the story better. And that's what you can kind of expect as a GM in this game, is a robust enough system that you're going to have the language that you need to be able to make rulings, but not a crunchy enough system where you're going to have rules lawyers arguments where you're debating a single word and how it's interpreted or anything like that. So, yeah, moving on. The third group. What should Lorehounds expect? To be blunt, this is not a playtest for Lorehounds. Playtests in general are not meant to test the story of the game. They're meant to test the mechanics. There is a little bit of lore in here. They talk about the basic kind of makeup of the world. In the more GM-focused sections, they do have a bunch of locations that are described, which are very, very lore-heavy, but compared to the rest of the book, they're very lore-heavy, but even then, it's not a lot. Like the Sablewood, it's really just meant as a starting off point for one-shots or parts of a campaign. It's in the running a campaign section. But for like the Sablewood, it has a little section, Distinctions, where it gives a very, like, a short paragraph that kind of describes what it is. And then it has these little subsections: Endless Verdants, Hybrid Fauna, The Spires, Well-Worn Pathways, Underroot, and then it talks about GM's principles, and then some other landmarks and stuff in that particular area. Some settlements, some factions that exist in there, and then you get a few stat blocks and some GM tools that you can use to run stuff in there. So as far as, you know, getting a really clear picture of the world that Daggerheart is kind of set, like the default world of Daggerheart, you're not really going to get it here. These are more kind of story hooks that GMs are that are. I'm going to try this one more at a time. These are more story hooks and location hooks that GMs can use to help build a campaign, so they don't have to create everything themselves. Does that mean that Lorehounds have, you know, shouldn't even think about this? No. It will give you a rough idea of where the kind of default campaign setting for this is going to be going. And again, it's free, but the entire purpose of this playtest is to playtest it. And for the most part, Lorehounds are really not going to be play testing anything. So, to be blunt, this isn't written for Lorehounds. And it's just not really meant for Lorehounds. And so they really don't put a lot in here that's going to appeal to Lorehounds. When the final book comes out, like, just reading the playtest material here, it's obvious that they have a very interesting, unique world already built for this. They just didn't include it in here because it doesn't really affect the mechanics that much. So, yeah, that's what you could expect being a Lorehound. So, moving on. So yeah, that's kind of what you can expect if you want to get into this. My personal recommendation, I'm excited about this. I've looked it over. I haven't had a chance to build a character myself yet because it has been a weird day today already. If you watched my video before, I had to replace a filter on my air purifier, and it started whistling, and that was a nightmare. And anyway, so I haven't had a chance to actually physically build a character, but in addition to having like character sheets and everything you need so that you can print them off to build your character, Demiplane, which is the place that has like it's basically D&D Beyond for not D&D, though they are adding D&D 5th edition on there, which I find hilarious. It has a bunch of different things, like the Marvel Multiverse RPG is there, Avatar Legends is there, and I actually have, I think, almost every book for Avatar Legends on my Nexus account there. Demiplane has its, or Daggerheart has its own Nexus there, where you can go, you can read the rules there, and it's actually it's a remarkably good interface. And you can also, they have a character builder there, so you can build your character right there. You can use Demiplane to technically run your character and use it as an interactive character sheet like you would with D&D Beyond. So overall, very, very cool. Makes character creation an absolute breeze. I'm extremely excited about this game, and I can't wait to see where it goes. I may even be running a few one-shots just to get a feel for it. We will see if I can find players and the time. Because, again, I'm already running 3 campaigns. That's the last thing that I needed to do is add a 4th. But, yeah, cool stuff. So, that is the end of the What to Expect section. Now, let's get into the in-depth preview. Now, as a reminder, when I say in-depth, I mean in-depth. I am going to be going chapter by chapter, sometimes page by page. I'm going to be talking about the things that I like, the things that I don't like, the things I think they did well, the things I think they need to do better. Now, these videos get very, very long. We have only done the what should you expect, and we're already almost 40 minutes. I do put timestamps into all of these things, so you can come back later. You can watch it in bits and pieces. I do my best to label them so that you know what's going to be in each section. So don't feel bad if you can't do this all in one sitting. I know for YouTube in the algorithm, I'm supposed to tell you, watch the entire thing from beginning to end 17 times. I just don't think that that is a logical thing for anyone to do. So please do not feel bad. Feel free to skip around. That's what the timestamps are for. Watch this in 3 or 4 or 5 different parts. The entire purpose of this is to give you guys an idea of what this system is going to be like and what I think should happen. After I'm done recording this video, I am probably going to fill out my first survey for this because there's a few kind of glaring things that I want to get into their attention quickly. And I mentioned before, I previously was put into the playtest program, and unfortunately I was unable to submit feedback during that playtest period because my health just dropped like a rock. So there's a few things in here that I'm just going to hopefully be doing quickly, and then as I get more comfortable with it, I will probably do more surveys and things like that to give them more information because I want this game to be as good as I think it can be. So, that being said, let us dive into the in-depth preview. All right. Section, I guess, -1. I want to talk about the introduction. So, the introduction is your kind of standard introduction, but I wanted to talk about the touchstone sections. Introduction, welcome to Daggerheart. What is a tabletop role-playing game? What kind of role-playing game is Daggerheart? And this is where they go. Daggerheart is a heroic, narrative-focused experience with combat as a prominent aspect of play. So, combat is a big part of the game, and it's very narrative-focused, and it's also a heroic narrative. So when we talk about a heroic narrative, we're not talking about something like Call of Cthulhu, or I would even go as far as to say something like Game of Thrones. I would not consider a quote-unquote heroic narrative because a lot of Game of Thrones is very much more drama focused, and there's a lot of situations where the characters that you're rooting for are just put in these situations that suck. Heroic is you are the hero, you are the main characters of the story, and the purpose of the story is to talk about that one time that you triumphed. So it's going to be about the day something happened, and there's going to be cool things happening, and your characters are going to be special in some way. It's not absurdist, it's not nihilistic or anything. It's heroic. But then they also talk about the fact that Daggerheart utilized an asymmetrical design. And I guess I should have talked about this in the GM section. Something unique about Daggerheart. We talked about how players are rolling 2d12. When GMs roll, they roll a single d20 for their checks and for checks of monsters. Monsters don't get hope or fear results. They either succeed or they fail. And that's another thing I find really, really fascinating about this system, which is not the strangest thing. Again, I go back to Open Legend just because I personally think it was a very monumental system. Open Legend had asymmetrical aspects as well, whereas players, every roll matters. For the GM, you can just fail when you make your rolls, and when NPCs do stuff, they can just excuse me. NPCs and monsters and stuff can just fail, but if players fail, they are given options of how they can still move this story forward. So that was kind of a mild asynchronous or asymmetrical design. Daggerheart goes a little bit further, where the DM and the players roll massively different dice. And from a probability standpoint, if you're rolling a d20, you have an equal chance of rolling every number from 1 to 20. You have a 5% chance of any number showing up. When you are dealing with 2d12, the distribution is changed. You can technically roll anything from a 2 all the way up to a 24, but because it's 2 dice, you're significantly more likely to roll in the middle than you are to roll at either end of the extreme. What that basically means is it weights kind of doing the average more than any other, more than rolling a single die. And every time you add more dice to a dice pool, it's going to make it significantly easier to roll the average. If we're looking at like a 2d10 system, you have a 1 in 10 chance of rolling an 11, and that is the most common roll you will make is an 11. If you add in, I legit just found a website that does this for me called anydice.com. But if I do 2d10, so if you look at, there's a 10% chance to roll an 11. If you expand to both a 12 and a 10, so the chance of rolling either a 10, 11, or 12 is going to be 28. So about a quarter of the time you roll, 1 in 4, you're going to get either a 10, 11, or a 12. When you go out to 9 to 13, that adds another 16 to that, so that brings you up to 44. So if you're going between 9 and 13, you have an almost 50% chance, basically almost half your rolls are going to end up anywhere between a 9 and a 13 when you're rolling 2d to 10. If we change that to a 2d12, the most common roll is going to be a 13. And then again, once you get off down to between 10 and 15, that's going to make up the majority of your rolls are going to be probably between, I think it's like 9 and 16 is going to be close to the majority of your rolls. So as you can see, compared to you can get a spread of any of these numbers, you are now much closer to that. And it does mean that it makes it easier to kind of predict probabilities and predict how often certain good things and bad things are going to happen. It's one of the reasons why the fear and hope system makes things that much more interesting, because a lot of the times you are, depending on the difficulty that you're going for, you're either going to succeed or fail, but you're probably going to know which those is going to be before you roll. You know, hey, I know that I have a really good chance of succeeding on this, and the thing that's going to be significantly more random is going to be whether you succeed or fail with fear or hope. Doesn't mean that you can't succeed on something that you were most definitely going to fail on, or you can't fail on something that you thought you were going to succeed. The other thing that's kind of interesting, to get a crit on this, anytime you roll doubles, so you could roll double ones, that counts as a critical success, I believe. So I want to look at critical. I'd have to find the page again, and I'm not there yet. But so yeah, like it does make things kind of interesting. But anyway, getting back to the touchstones, these are the game systems in the books and stuff that inspired Daggerheart. And I want to read through all of them and then specifically talk about the special appreciation, because it talks about the stuff that actually got put into the system. So for TTRPGs, 13th Age, Apocalypse Keys, Apocalypse World, Blades in the Dark, City of Mist, Cortex Prime, Cypher System, Dishonored, Dungeons and Dragons, Flee Mortals, For the Queen, Genesis, Lady Blackbird, Masks: A New Generation, Pathfinder, Shadowrun, The Quiet Year, Wild Sea, and Slug Blaster. So if Daggerheart interests you and you get annoyed with the fact that it's not a full game yet, this is kind of a list of games that you should probably look into, because there's going to be aspects to it that you probably like in these games. Not all of them are going to have all the aspects that you want, but they're not bad. For books, A Song of Ice and Fire series, A Wizard of Earthsea, Sabriel, The Wheel of Time, the Lord of the Rings series. So your kind of standard high fantasy books in general. For movies and television, The Dragon Prince, Lord of the Rings, The Witcher, The Legend of Vox Machina. That I find absolutely hilarious. Yes, we know you're made by Critical Role and you're inspired by your own stuff. Moving on. Then video games, Borderlands, Dragon Age Inquisition, Outriders, and the Elder Scrolls series. This touchstone thing is probably the greatest way that you can get people interested in the game. Because if you think about like Dragon Age Inquisition, did you enjoy Dragon Age Inquisition? Did you enjoy how the game played, how you created your characters, how you grew your characters? There's a lot of Dragon Age Inquisition in this game. There are subclasses and masteries and the things like that. I'm actually kind of fascinated that they didn't mention the age system anywhere in here, because a lot of the way that the characters kind of grow in that does have kind of an age system feeling to it. But yeah, but then they talk about special appreciation. This is basically where they kind of got the idea for a number of different mechanical aspects. So specifically for special appreciation, the Genesis system was a major inspiration for the 2-axis results of the duality dice. That's the fear and hope dice. So if that is a really interesting thing to you, maybe you should look up Genesis. Genesis spelled Genesis. Next one, the Cypher system's GM intrusions pave the way for spending fear to interrupt a scene. So again, I mentioned that before. That's where I got the idea for the Cypher system and GM intrusions, because they specifically say it in here. Among other things, Dungeons & Dragons Advantage-Disadvantage system was particularly inspirational in the dice mechanics. 13th Age's backgrounds heavily inspired the experience mechanic. If you haven't watched my 13th Age Designing New Dragons series, we actually build characters in 13th Age, and we can see how the background system was particularly fun in creating interesting, unique characters. Next, Blades in the Dark and Apocalypse World helped shape the narrative game flow, and their playbooks inspired a lot of the character sheet development. So if you're familiar with kind of the Powered by the Apocalypse playbook style character sheets, they're probably going to feel a little bit similar to what you're looking at here. The Wild Seas Phenomenal Reaches section provided the chassis for the region section of this book. Enemy types and ways of managing minions are informed by Dungeons & Dragons 4th edition and Monster Design of Flea Mortals. D&D 4E for the win! Like I said before, it is probably the greatest combat design has ever been, is when it was in for the 4th edition. It was so much fun to create monsters in that, and they bring it back here, and I love it so much. Next, the Quiet Year inspired the map building section of the campaign kit, and the sample session 0 structure is informed by Apocalypse Keys. So the special appreciations is a really great way for people like me, and I would assume a lot of people that watch this, when you are very familiar with, or relatively familiar with, a bunch of different RPGs, the special appreciation system is great for you going, oh, I recognize this, I recognize that. And also, if you like Daggerheart, the special appreciation section is a great way to introduce you to other games. It's like, you know, I really love this duality fear-hope thing. Maybe I should check out, thank you, phone. Maybe I should check out the Genesis system, because apparently they have something similar to that in there. Or, damn, creating monsters, creating encounters in this game is so much fun. I should probably go play 4th edition D&D forever and ever and ever, because it's the greatest D&D version ever, and anyone that says otherwise is dumb and a poopy face. But yeah, so I really, really love this. I'm seeing this a lot more often in indie RPGs. You don't see this from major manufacturers because they want you to think that they came up with everything on their own and they would never copy anyone else. But indie RPGs are perfectly fine going, yeah, these are other games that we thought were cool that made us want to create this game. So yeah, I love stuff like that. And then they have this kind of constantly throughout the playtest manuscript, is they will have this recommendation. Like they have here, they have player principles. Be a fan of your character and their journey. Spotlight your allies. Play to find out what happens. This phrase comes up over and over and over again. Address the characters and address the players. Hold on gently, build the world together. They give this kind of advice throughout the entire book, and I think from a design standpoint and from a readability standpoint, these are really, really great because they're not just located in one particular section. This book really is designed to be read from front to back as opposed to use like a textbook or not really a textbook, an encyclopedia where you basically just open it up and you look for the particular bit of information you want. This is designed to be read in a particular order. And I think for the most part they do that well. There's a problem that they make here that I've talked about over and over and over again. I don't think it's ever going to go away because this is how Wizards of the Coast does it. But we'll talk about that in a second. And that's going to be one of the big things I put in my first bit of feedback is don't do this. You're not Dungeons and Dragons. Don't pretend to be. They do it wrong. And then they give some real basic overview of like the world itself. Like they have the core realms where you have the mortal realm, the hollows above, the circles below, which is basically, prime material plane, heaven and hell is what that is. And I do like the fact that they have created a very, very interesting lore-based explanation of how existence works. And then they talk about magic and spells and flavoring, and then your more kind of basic stuff of what you need to play. One of the things that is kind of interesting, again, this is technically a card-based game, and what I mean by that is just like in 4th edition, if you've ever seen me build 4th edition characters, you know that they all have those little ability cards. That you don't play them like you would in poker where you just do that, but you have a card and each card has an ability or a power or something on it. They do basically the same thing here where your ancestry is a card that will have an ability written on it. Your domain cards, all of your domain abilities are cards. And you actually have a limit to how many abilities you can have on your character at once. I think you can have a maximum of 5 different cards that are not your subclass, ancestry, or environment. So beyond those 3 cards, you only have 5 cards, which is perfectly fine at level 1. But once you get to about level 5, you actually will have your active cards, and then you'll have what's called your vault, which is the abilities that aren't currently equipped effectively. And they have a mechanic where you can burn stress to basically trade cards out. And more powerful cards cost more stress. So it is an interesting thing. Another thing that you need to have available is these things called character tokens. And basically what those are, and we'll go over it a little bit more when we actually talk about the combat section. But it's basically just when you do certain things and you are in effectively initiative. They don't technically have initiative in this game. Again, we'll talk about it when we get to that section. But whenever you do something, you put a character token down, and then the GM can spend the character tokens that you put down there to do his turn effectively. And it creates a really interesting, kind of similar to Popcorn Initiative, but not really. Again, we'll talk about it a little bit better, but those are the kind of things that you'll be playing with. You will have your dice that you use, you will have your cards, and then you'll also have character tokens that you will sometimes need to use. And there's not a limited number of character tokens. You just need to have something physical so that the GM knows how many actions they can take. It's a really interesting system. And then they talk about maps and miniatures, and then they talk about lines and veils and X card and all that other stuff like that. And that is the introduction. Moving on. Part 1. Preparing for adventure. This is the problem that so many books have. I was hoping they wouldn't do this. They did it. Preparing for adventure is the character creation chapter. It does talk about have a session 0. Think about character concepts. Get a character sheet and guide. This is the character creation chapter. And because the characters themselves are effectively card-based, you basically get most of your ability to build a character right here. And I've said this many, many times before. I will probably continue to say it ad absurdum. Do not introduce character creation before you've explained the rules. Now, in the introduction, they did give brief overviews of the dice and, you know, the fact that you're rolling 2d12, but they don't explain the system at all. And then they immediately go into character creation because that's what D&D does. And D&D is the best. And so you have to... No, please, for the love of God, stop doing this. If you are creating a new system, the first thing you should do after you do, what is a tabletop RPG? You should introduce your system. Talk about how everything works before you talk about character classes. And this is something, if you ever do want to create your own tabletop RPG, when you get to the character creation section, replace anything that you have not gone into complete details on with the word gobbledygook. And then see how easy it is to understand your game. So choose your ancestry. We don't know what ancestry is. It hasn't really been defined. They do have choose your heritage. That's your heritage. The aspect of your character includes two elements: their ancestry and their community. Character's ancestry reflects their lineage and impacts the way they physically look as well credit. So we've defined ancestry, so we don't have to replace it with gobbledygook. And then they describe every single one of these. So we have Clank, Daemon, Dracona, Dwarf, Elf, Fairy, Faun, Furbolg, Fungrill, Gallopet, Giant, Goblin, but none of these have been defined. So what we should be saying is take the card of the ancestry you choose. Here are some examples. Gobbledygook, 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 and of course, gobbledygook. We don't know what any of these things mean. So they're completely worthless to us. Especially if this is your first time ever playing. And a lot of these things, like a Clank. Well, what is a Clank? Well, if you look in the section, Clank is a robot. They are the Warforged of this campaign. Or a Qatari. I've got no idea what a Qatari is. Qatari are cat people. It's what they are. Ribbit. You can probably guess what a ribbit is. If you guessed that it was a 14-foot tall thing that somewhat resembled a mushroom with feet and fur, then you'd be wrong. They're frog people. But yeah, by introducing this stuff, you're just putting random words in front of them that don't mean anything. If you want to have a create your character section where you just kind of go over it, that's perfectly fine. You don't need to list all of this because all it is gobbledygook. Next, choose your community. They do define what community is, and then they go highborn, lowerborn, gobbledygook, 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 gobbledygook. Doesn't mean anything. And then it says you can learn more about these communities in the upcoming community section. So now, and they do have this nice hyperlink thing where if I click on ancestries, it'll take me right to the ancestry section. But that means they are already building the book to where you can't just read the book. You have to be randomly jumping between various pages, which unless you either have multiple bookmarks included in the book, which they have done. Like I have right here, I have the Tal'Dorei campaign setting Reborn, and I want to see if I can get to it. I should be able to open it up. They have, in the Tal'Dorei campaign setting Reborn, they have a built-in bookmark. They have one built-in bookmark. So you can use something like that, which I will assume they probably are going to have. They're probably going to have that in this book, but it still means you have to flip back and forth just to understand what you're looking at. You don't need to do this. Don't introduce something if you don't have the space to define it. And definitely don't introduce stuff that you're like, well, you don't know what this means, but trust me, you'll understand later. We just wanted to tell you about it now because this is what D&D does. Don't do this. Assign your character traits. This is nice. It explains kind of how traits work. But it doesn't like agility, sprint, leap, maneuver. And they talk about the verbs after each trait, such as sprint, leap, and maneuver, are examples of actions you might take that would involve that trait. These words are just inspirations. They don't limit what that trait might be used for. So they define what agility is, but they don't tell you what that means, how you're going to be rolling it, where it's going to show up. Again, they haven't introduced how the system plays. They're just giving you this information without a basis. They talk about the invasion score. They don't talk to you about how you get your evasion score other than it's based on your character class. You don't know how to calculate it or anything. Hit points and stress. They talk about that. They talk about damage thresholds, but you don't know what that really means. You also don't really understand a whole lot of anything. So the weird thing about this is they do a somewhat good idea of introducing a lot of different traits in here, but they don't introduce any of the mechanical aspects. So while you understand hit point and stress, you don't understand how combat is run. You don't understand how you're spending stress or anything like that. They just kind of tell you what hit points and stress are. And so it makes for a very confusing thing. Because there's some things... there are some things on here that make perfect sense. And then there are other things, well, we'll talk about this later. Don't do that. Don't force your players, especially for Critical Role, where you have a lot of people that are into Critical Role that have never played an RPG before. And they just really love watching the voice actors do the funny voices and role play. You're going to have people that have never played a tabletop RPG before looking at this and getting incredibly confused because they have no idea what a dice roll is. They have no idea. This assumes that you're already familiar with how tabletop RPGs work, which never should be how you make a brand new tabletop RPG. If you're making stuff for D&D, fine. D&D has existed for 50 years, and literally every other tabletop RPG is at least inspired by Dungeons & Dragons because they created the system. But you're not D&D. So you need to not do this stuff. And it annoys me so much. This is actually a pretty good chapter. If it wasn't focused on, hey, let's tell you how to build a character before you understand what any of this shit means. Yeah, I would... Part 1 and Part 2 need to be flipped. And I've said this so many times. I said it for Essence 20. You don't put your this is how you play the game as the second section of your book after character creation. I understand a lot of people are really excited about character creation. A lot of players will only read the character creation section. And then they will expect the GM to teach them how to play. Don't do this. You guys are smarter than this. Put Part 2 as Part 1. Introduce the game first, then do character creation. You don't even have to change a whole lot. Again, because there are so many sections here that are already hyperlinked, all you have to do is move them over, and then instead of things like anytime you make an action roll, see action rolls in Part 2. So anytime you make a gobbledygook, if you feel like an experience can help you succeed, you can spend a hope, which hasn't really been defined here at all. So anytime you make a gobbledygook, if you feel like an experience, which has been defined, could help you succeed, you can spend a gobbledygook to add its modifier to your roll. Sometimes you might feel like more than one of your experiences is a good fit for the situation. If it fits the story, you can apply more than one experience to a gobbledygook, spending a gobbledygook for each. None of that makes sense because those words haven't been defined yet. And again, it may sound like I'm being pedantic about this. It's like, well, everybody knows what a role is. They don't. This is something that I learned from years of training and interacting with customers, specifically when it comes to computers. My father was a senior software specialist at one of the largest law firms in the world. He had a degree in computer information services. I grew up with a computer when computers weren't common. When the company he was working for would throw shit out, he was allowed to take some of it home for us. So I grew up, like when I was 7 years old, I learned how to use DOS. And I learned basic, I learned my first programming language when I was in 8th grade. I learned Turbo C++, and I'd forgotten most of it by now. I used to program my calculator well enough that my teachers allowed me to use my programs on tests to make things easier for me, because I programmed everything myself. I am very familiar with how computers work. And now, if you look at kids that were born this millennia, they have never lived in a world without computers. And so a lot of things that you take for granted simply are not things that everybody knows. I would have customers, and this is again about, I guess it's been closer to 15 years now. This is 10, 15 years ago. I would have customers come in for computer support, and I worked at an office supply store that just so happened to offer computer support. And if they came in, I could do things like, well, have you tried turning it off and on again? That old, IT crowd thing. There are people that don't know what that means. If I say, hey, why don't you just go ahead and shut down your computer? They will push the button on the monitor and turn their monitor off, not realizing that doesn't turn the computer off at all. That was a common problem that we had to deal with. Or the master power switch. There are a lot of people that own computers that have no idea there is a master power switch on their computer. They have never turned their power supply off. So when I get pedantic about this thing, is like we haven't defined what an action role is. Because, that's really simple. Like anyone could figure out with context clues what an action role is. No, they can't. That's my point, because I've seen it over and over and over again. We assume that our knowledge is what everybody has, and that's where communication issues come up. So having a chapter where they just talk about undefined terms is going to confuse new players. And if you're going to force the players to flip to like 7 different pages in order to read a single paragraph, they're going to give up. So again, always start with explain the system, then do character creation. Don't start with character creation. Just stop doing this. Okay. They keep going through it. Choose your domain cards. They give an example character. They talk about the different domains and what they do. All of this is really, really great stuff for a part 2. Don't put it in chapter 1. They talk about the loadout and the vaults. Again, other really, really great stuff that doesn't mean anything because they don't know how the system works. And then they go for the characters themselves, which again is perfectly fine for a chapter 2. But they haven't explained what the vast majority of this stuff means. Like they talk about proficiency. Increase your proficiency by 1. We don't know what proficiency means. It has not been defined, and yet it is something that they talk about in here. Oh, this is my biggest pet peeve when I'm dealing with indie RPGs is when they put character creation first, because it's just a bad idea. And again, this is Critical Role. People are going to put in the extra effort for it, but again, this is Critical Role. There are a lot of people that don't play RPGs that are going to be interested in this because it's Critical Role, and you're going to confuse the fuck out of them. And they're going to have a bad experience because they don't understand how this stuff is supposed to work. So, just annoys the hell out of me so much. So we go through all the different characters. By the way, the character classes in this, none of them are going to change your life. All of them are super, super cool. Like, I'm excited to play every single character class in this. They all look really, really cool. And again, there's enough kind of customization in them that you can have 2 players playing the same class and still have very different characters. And to me, that is the mark of a good RPG. if the only way you can play your RPG is everyone has to choose a different class, then you've created an extremely limited RPG. You should be able to have multiple people playing the same class, and they should still feel special. So that's something that they do really, really well. So just going through all of these, and then they start talking about the ancestries, which is nice. But again, this is all character stuff. We don't know. Like here, really good example. Ancestry feature for the Dracona, which are Dragonborn. At character creation, choose one of the following elements to describe your elemental breath: fire, ice, lightning, poison, and acid. We don't know what any of those are, other than the fact that we know what fire and ice and lightning and poison and acid. But what's the difference between poison and acid? Isn't poison acidic? I always thought that poison was acidic. Why is poison and acid something different? Well, again, if you've played D&D, you know that they're different things. But here you don't. So we might as well go, choose one of the following elements to describe your breath: gobbledygook, 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 or gobbledygook. Spend a gobbledygook to make a gobbledygook using your breath against an enemy or group of enemies within close range. Deal gobbledygook magic damage, or gobbledygook damage to all enemies you succeed against. We don't know what any of this stuff means, so we don't know if this is useful, how it's going to be useful. None of it makes sense. What's an instinct roll? All right, I guess they did define instinct because that's one of the traits. But they didn't actually... They talk about the traits. I don't know if they actually talked about the fact that make an instinct roll means roll and add your instinct to it. Because, again, they haven't described how you play the game yet. So it's just gobbledygook, 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 gobbledygook. The races themselves are impressive, to say the least. This is another thing that feels very 4th edition to me. In 4th edition, every race had a racial ability. It was a power built into your race. Again, my personal favorite was the Eladrin, and it was because their racial power was phase step. You got a free teleport action. It was so much fun. You could use it once per encounter, so it was just so good and so much fun. And there was ways to upgrade it. It was just so great. Another thing that I really, really enjoy, the Fun Grill, are mushroom people. They sound like a bunch of really fun guys. I love the fact that they have mushroom people. It's actually incredibly impressive just how many different ancestries they've put in here, because they have the stuff that you would expect. You know, basically any D&D 5th edition race in the core book exists here. And then a bunch of other ones that I just wasn't expecting. Like a fairy race, fawns. They've got furbolgs. Galapa is tortoises. Which there is a difference between turtles and tortoises. Understand, tortoises are land-based, turtles are water-based. But I would assume Galapa comes from the Galapagos Islands, which are it's a major habitat for tortoises. I think tortoises is the right plural. Anyway, so they have turtle people, or tortoise people, giants, goblins, halflings, and then Katari, your cat people, Ribbit, frog people, Simia, monkey people. Though they do, the artwork that they have here is not purely monkeys. Like they have one that kind of has orangutan vibes to it. And I think there's others that, yeah, there's one, and they don't have like full color art here. They just have kind of artistic sketches. But one of them does have a very strong kind of gorilla vibe to it. So basically anything... yeah, well here, they have semi resemble anthropomorphic monkeys and apes. And monkeys and apes are different, folks. Gotta understand that. And they even have mixed ancestry rules, which are, again, relatively simple, but allows for, you know, if your mama was a frog and your daddy was a tortoise, you're going to be fucked up. I'm just going to put it out there. You're going to be fucked up. And then they talk about community, which is basically the equivalent of D&D backgrounds. But again, I think I like... And they're basically like highborn, you were rich. Lowborn, you were poor. Orderborn. You were raised in a plate of great discipline or faith. So highborn, lowborn, economics. Orderborn, you grew up in the church. Ridgeborn, you grew up in the mountains. Seaborn, Slyborn, you grew up in the underbelly, in the criminal. Underborn, you grew up underground. Wanderborn, you're a nomad. Wildborn, you were raised in the forest. So I really, really like the fact that your backgrounds can be economic, because your economic background vastly changes how you view the world. I don't think people quite understand how differently you view the world if you grow up poor versus growing up middle class versus growing up wealthy. Like things, like the idea of growing up poor, you will learn to gauge things based on opportunity cost. And basically what that means is you go, okay, well, I could go swimming today, but swimming costs me 2 lunches because lunch would normally cost me $5 and swimming costs me $10. So is going to the swimming park for one day worth me skipping 2 lunches? Opportunity cost is the language of poor people. And I know this because I grew up very poor and I lived most of my life very, very poor. I think in the entirety of my life, I have made more than the federal poverty level, I think 2 years. So opportunity cost is how you view things. You don't view things in dollar and cents. You go, that's a meal, that's a tank of gas, that is this, that is that. Everything is built on opportunity cost. If you just get up into the middle class, everything changes. You start looking at things by price and price per pound and things like that. Like just that tiny little bit of difference changes how you view the world and it changes how you make decisions. So the fact that your economic starting point can vastly change how you view the world makes sense. But also where you grew up is going to change as well. If you grew up in the church like I did, you view the world in a very, very special, demented way that I have slowly been kind of changing. I don't think growing up in the church was horrible for me. I'm still a practicing Christian. I still believe very, very strongly in Christianity being true and things like that. However, the church is a very, very weird place, and things don't work in the church the way that they do in the real world. And especially like me, if you grow up very insulated inside the church, when you get out into the real world, it is a huge culture shock. And then other things, growing up in the mountains is different than growing up at sea or growing up as a nomad. So I love the fact that they have this aspect of this aspect of kind of acknowledging like where you come from is going to change how you view the world, and each one has again an ability. They call it a community feature. So like for the Slyborn, your community feature, you have advantage on any rolls when you're negotiating with criminals, detecting lies, or finding a safe place to hide. But they haven't defined what advantage is yet, so you have gobbledygook on any rolls. Yeah. And then they talk about adjusting abilities and spells, specifically if you wanted to play a character with some kind of disability or something that makes you different. They have an entire little section that talks about stuff like that. Which I find interesting. And I guess I should talk about, despite the fact that I'm really pissed off that they did this, I should talk about the different classes since we're in that section. I would like it to be in another section, but I don't get to choose that. So the classes that exist in here are the Bard. And the Bard, in and of themselves, is kind of interesting. Basically, they have this ability called Rally, where every time somebody rolls with fear, meaning their fear die is higher. Again, they haven't explained how any of this works yet, so none of this makes sense. Anytime somebody rolls with fear, you have a d6 that you put on your character sheet. It starts with a 1. Anytime somebody rolls a fear, you move it up 1 number. So it goes 1, 2, 3, 4. Once it gets once it gets above 6, so it's a 6. Somebody rolls a fear. You return it to you take the die off and you give everybody in the party a d6 rally die. And they can spend that die to roll it and add the result to any action roll, reaction roll, or damage roll. Again, none of those things have been displayed or described, so they can spend this die to roll it and add the result to any gobbledygook, or gobbledygook. So yeah, it's basically as the party rolls fear, you kind of gain this rally thing, and eventually you can just give it to everyone, which is really interesting. And then you also have subclasses that will sometimes modify stuff like that. But kind of the defining feature, if we're talking about how I used to describe 5th edition characters, the defining feature of the Bard is this rally feature. They can basically bolster their allies, and it's based on how badly the party is rolling, to be honest. As far as I can tell from here, you only get one rally die per session because it's at the beginning of a session. Place a d6 on your character sheet. So you can only get a rally die once per session. So depending on how long your sessions in are, your rally die might not be as useful. And they do have a thing. If your rally die hasn't finished this countdown by the end of a session, distribute the current value shown on the die as hope amongst your party, splitting it any way you choose, and remove the die. So let's say you only got up to a 5 and the session ends. You can give out 5 hope to the rest of the party. So there still is useful things to it, but longer sessions are going to benefit a bard more than anything else. And then you have subclasses effectively. And the 2 subclasses for bards are Heart of a Poet, which use your words to do stuff, or Rousing Speech is the other one, and once per long rest you have a Heartfelt Inspiring Speech. So Rousing Speech lets you clear stress. Heart of a Poet lets you add a d6 to an action roll if you're doing bard-like things. And then those things can get more and more useful as you keep going. So it's the bard. The druid, they have 2 class features. Wild Touch, which is basically nature prestidigitation. And then Beast Form, your kind of standard druid thing that can change into shapes. And then the subclasses are Warden of the Elements, which is more of a spellcasting kind of thing. And then Warden of Renewal, which is a more healing kind of thing. So you have kind of offense or defense versions of druids. And then the Beast Form thing, yeah, they have categories of beasts as opposed to you get to take on the stat block of a monster. You just have categories of beasts that I think just work significantly better. And they change as you get higher. Like level 1, you can become an Agile Scout, a Pack Predator, or an Aquatic Scout. So Agile Scout, the examples they give: Fox, Mouse, Weasel; Pack Predator, Wolf, Coyote, Hyena; Aquatic Scout, Fish, Eel, Octopus. And you have specific things that you can do while that. And then when you get higher levels, things like level 5, you can get a Great Winged Beast or a Speedy Beast. Speedy Beast would be like a panther. Great Winged Beast would be like a giant eagle. Stuff like that. So interesting. Guardian is kind of Paladin-esque, but not really. They're defensive powerhouses. Their class features Unstoppable. Oh wait, yeah, the Guardian is technically the Barbarian adjacent. So once per long rest, you become unstoppable. Your unstoppable die begins as a d4. And then while unstoppable, you resistant to physical damage. You add a d6 to any damage rolls you make. You can spend stress to reroll any single die you've rolled. And anytime you roll your damage dice, you reduce the unstoppable die value by 1. So basically, every time you make an attack, your unstoppable ticks down. So kind of a weird, it's not technically a rage, but it's similar to a rage mechanic. And then the subclasses are the Stalwart, which is your defense foamist, and your Vengeance, which is a more offense focused one. Ranger. Your class feature is Ranger Focus. Spend hope and make an attack with your weapon. On a success, you temporarily have focus on the target along with doing damage from the attack. While focus, you know where they are. You do extra damage. And on a missed attack, you can end the focus to basically re-roll your die. So it kind of combines Hunter's Mark and Oath of Vengeance from 4th edition, where it lets you kind of re-roll attacks against your Oath of Enmity. That's what it was, Oath of Enmity. It's kind of a combination of those. And then your subclass, Wayfinder, is your kind of more Strider style Ranger. And then Companion, that's your Beastmaster Ranger. And from what I'm seeing here, again, they take all of the lessons that 5th edition learned about how to not make a pet-based class and learn from them. The Ranger Companion, significantly cooler, significantly easier, and you actually get to use them more often. So, cool stuff. Rogue is exactly what it sounds like. Their class features Hide. When you move into a location where no enemies can see you, you're hidden, which is one of the 3 status effects that exist in the game currently. And then you have a Sneak Attack, where always add a d8 to your damage roll when your sneak attack stuff works. Then your subclasses are Syndicate, which is kind of your manipulator style rogue, or Nightwalker, which is a Shadow Dancer, effectively. It's the one that I'm kind of leaning towards too. And probably the first character I'm creating is going to be a Nightwalker rogue, and the weapon I'm going to give them lets them punch, so I can make my monk. So they don't have a monk in here yet. Daring to impress. We need a monk. This is not cool, okay? Seraph. That's effectively your cleric. Your class feature, Prayer Dice. Beginning of the session, roll a number of d4 equal to your spellcasting trait and then store them on the right. You can exhaust them at any time to use their value in reducing incoming damage, adding to a roll result, or exchanging for that many hope you may give to any player. Clear these dice at the end of session. So basically, they have this ability to protect people, increase things, or increase rolls, or give players hope. So very kind of nice supporting thing. And your subclasses are Winged Sentinel. You get to fly. You burn hope to take flight. And it's a little bit more kind of aggressive. And then Divine Wielder is your paladin form. Which is the foundation feature for it, the first feature that you get. Spirit Weapon. When you have a melee weapon equipped, it can fly from your hand to strike an enemy and return to you. You are Thor. And then mark a stress to also apply this attack to another targeted range on the same attack roll. So you are Thor and can hit multiple things. Very cool, very interesting. Sorcerer is your kind of classic innate caster archetype. Your class features Arcane Sense. You can sense the presence of magical people and objects, so you have kind of magic sight. You can cast Minor Illusion, and then channel Raw Power. Once per long rest, you can place a domain card from your loadout into your vault and choose either gain hope equal to the level of the card or add magic damage equal to twice the level of that card to a spell you successfully cast. As I mentioned before, your loadout is you have a set number of cards you can have at any given time. Any cards in addition to that are in your vault, and it takes something out of your vault and put it into your loadout. It costs stress. So this is just a way you basically burn a card, and then if you want to use that ability again, you have to burn stress to be able to do it, and you can get things. So it's kind of similar to the spell point system or sorcery point system in 5th edition, but a little bit different. Then your subclasses is Primal Origin or Elemental Origin. Primal is much closer to your 5th edition Sorcerer, where you can just kind of modify spells on the fly, whereas Elemental is you're going to be much more kind of focused on, I'm really good at doing stuff with this particular element. Warrior is your more standard kind of fighters type thing. Your class features are Battle Strategist, Whenever you're making a roll to hinder a creature that isn't a weapon attack, shove, trip stuff, again, all stuff that they haven't explained, you can spend a hope to have advantage. On a success, you can choose to deal a d8 physical damage to the target. So it basically means if you are using the non-attack abilities, which are useful in most RPGs, but people go, well, they don't do any damage. You get to do damage and can burn a hope to do it. And then combat training, ignore burden when equipping weapons, and you may place primary weapons in your secondary weapon slot. Always add additional physical damage equal to the value level when you attack. So basically, combat training is a combination of monkey grip and dual wield. So, yeah, interesting stuff there. Then subclasses is Call the Slayer, Call the Brave. Slayer is kind of interesting. Where you basically can kind of avoid getting hope to just get extra dice that you can burn on a couple different things, and then Call the Brave. Whenever you fail a roll with fear, you gain hope. So Call the Brave would be my character class, because when I fail things and roll really poorly, I get extra good stuff. So that's nice. And then Wizard, your class feature Prestidigitation. It's your standard jack of all trades magic thing, if you want to do just harmless magic stuff. And then Strange Patterns. Choose a number between 1 and 12. Anytime you roll that number on a duality die, gain a hope or clear a stress. You may change this number to long rest. That is a massive, massive deal, because again, stress can power a lot of abilities. Stress, like the ability to just burn a stress whenever you roll, and you just get to choose the number. So if it was me, I would choose 1, because that's all I ever roll. But any time you roll that, it means that the wizard has more resources than any other class, which is actually really similar to how it plays in D&D 5th edition, where the wizard has more spells than any other class. Well, this is they just have more resources than any other class. And then your subclasses are School of Knowledge and School of War. School of War is just you do more damage and have more armor. You're more of a battle mage. School of Knowledge, you get more knowledge. Like the Foundation feature, when you face off against something of great magical power, you may spend a hope and ask the GM what you know about it that could help you here. They will tell you something useful or interesting about it. So interesting stuff there. That is all the classes. So, moving on. Part 2. Playing an Adventure. So, this is the one that should be Part 1. This explains how the game is played. It starts off with flow of the game, and this is really nice. And something that I think is really good in this is they give example interactions constantly, which is an extremely useful training tool. When I was younger, I thought one of the weirdest things in the world, in the Bible, because again, grew up in the church, something that happened constantly, is someone would come up and ask Jesus a question, because Jesus was known as Jesus was considered a genius, and so people would come up to him all the time and ask him questions. And instead of just giving an answer, he would go into a thing called a parable, which is basically a story that's meant to teach you something. And it used to confuse the hell out of me is by why when someone would come up to you, would you go, well, once upon a time? I'm like, that seems like the most annoying affectation ever. Like, I ask you, like, hey, do you know where the milk is? And you go, once upon a time, there was a boy who was looking for milk, and like, that would annoy the hell out of me. But when I got into training, I realized parables and that kind of training, where instead of just telling them what they want to know, you explain, you relate it to something that they understand already, and you give the why over just the what, is an extremely effective training method. And it turns into really, really high retention rates. So the fact that they do these example interactions and examples of the stuff that they have in here is just really, really great. Like flow of the game. This is how they describe flow of the game. GM narrates details, player and GM ask questions, player and GM answers questions, choose and resolve actions, repeat cycle. That's how they do it. Then they have an example interaction. I'm not going to read all of them, but I am going to read this one in particular. So you guys get an example of what it is. So here's an example of how a GM and player might interact to progress a scene. Emerson's character has just been caught trying to pickpocket an important letter off of a noble in a busy market square in a medium-sized town. How many guards did you say this lordling has? Emerson asks. 2 right there with him, and you suspect that there's another 2 out of uniform back a bit in the crowd. Great. I'm by an alley, right? I want to back off and find a place to climb up to the rooftop before anyone can catch me. Sure thing, the GM says. Based on the situation, they decide the PC doesn't need to roll to accomplish what they want to do. You're fast and the noble noticed you rather than the guards, so you can scramble up without a roll. The guards will be following you, though, and once you're all up on the roof, they're going to pull their crossbows and start shooting. Emerson asks, how close are the buildings here? Could I run and leap across the next building's roof? Not that far apart, the GM says. Certainly not any wider than what you're used to from growing up in the downside. That'd be an agility roll to escape across the rooftops, but heads up, if you don't succeed here, you'll probably take some serious damage from the fall. It's a long way down, the GM warns him. Emerson has +2 in agility and also chooses to spend a hope to use his +1 experience scoundrel here to make the leap. I know it's dangerous, but I can guarantee I've done this kind of jump before. He gathers 3 of his character tokens to represent the agility and scoundrel bonuses, then rolls his duality dice and the tokens together. The hope die lands on a 10, and the fear die lands on a 4. He combines these values together, 14, and also adds his 3 character tokens for a total of 17. Because his hope die rolled higher than fear, Emerson tells the GM, I rolled a 17 with hope. The GM nods. 17 is higher than the 15 difficulty they had in mind, and a success with hope means no meaningful consequences for this action. That's more than enough to escape the guards. They're armored and trying to take shots, but none of them get close to you, and they're not good enough at jumping to risk a fall. By the time you're 2 blocks away, you've completely lost them. Make sure to take hope for that roll, but now you're farther away from the noble and his letter you were trying to nab. What do you do? So this is a really, really great way to give real world information after you've kind of described, okay, well, this is how it's supposed to go, and here's an example of it being used in that particular way. None of this feels weird. The writing itself feels like a conversation I would have in a game that I was running. Which is not something that can always be said. I've seen quite a few of these examples where people are saying shit that just it's never said, because the person writing it is either a poor writer or has never interacted with human beings before. This is very comfortable language, and it makes it really easy to understand and follow. And they do this over and over and over again, and it's really, really helpful. Then we get to the what can I do on my turn, and then core mechanics. Here's the part that should have been at the beginning of the book. The duality dice, they actually explain what they are now. Rolling hope and fear, they explain all that. Critical success, whenever you make a duality roll, if both dice are the same number, you automatically roll a critical success, even if you would have otherwise failed because the total is lower than the roll's difficulty. This also counts as a roll with hope, but not only do you gain hope, you also clear a stress. So critical successes, very, very nice, and it's basically any time you roll doubles. They don't specifically have anything in here about it not counting snake eyes or anything. So according to what I read here, even if you roll double ones, that counts as a critical success. As far as I can tell, there is no critical failure. Failing with fear is the closest you get to a critical failure. Another thing that I'm not particularly upset they don't have in here. Crit fails can be fun, but I've seen way too many dungeon masters use it as a way to punish players for something they have no control over. The entire purpose of rolling a die is to add some randomness, to add some aspect to the game that the players don't have complete control over, and then punishing them because they can't control something that is intended to not be controllable is stupid. So, yeah, I'm happy that there's no critical fail in here. And then they talk about the different ways you can use hope. You can help an ally. You can utilize an experience, which is basically you say this experience applies. I get to add this bonus. Activate a hope feature. There's a few different abilities for different classes that says use a hope to be able to do it. Then they talk about the damage thresholds and hit points. And this is something I find absolutely fascinating. So again, the example they have here, the character has 6 hit points. And they also have 5 possible stress points. Their minor threshold is 6, major threshold is 11, severe threshold is 16. This, by far, I think is one of the most interesting aspects, and I don't know if this is taken from some other system or is inspired by some other system, or if this is 100% they created this just out of their head. But it means that you can have big numbers, because big numbers fun, but you don't have to worry about the big numbers changing everything. One of the issues with 4th edition is because everything is bigger in 4th edition, a first level Kika character is not going to ever be able to hit a monster that's designed for like 10th level Kika characters. They don't have high enough numbers. And the same thing is true in Pathfinder in 3rd edition as well. It was basically impossible for low-level characters to hit high-level monsters. And high-level monsters would one-shot low-level characters instantly. With this system, even if you are playing against, like, for whatever reason, like maybe Strahd shows up in your Giga game, which happens in Curse of Strahd, and you piss him off to where he makes an actual attack against you. In Curse of Strahd, he can just one-shot your character and instantly kill them. Like, he's that powerful, and you generally start off Curse of Strahd at level 3. So he could just one-shot your character. And there's not a whole lot you can do with it. In this system, even if he rolls like 32 damage, a severe wound is only 3 hit points. So by adding, basically they've added an additional buffer in to prevent insta-death effectively. And I think this is probably the best way I've ever seen something like this done. Because again, one of the reasons I hate running low-level D&D is it's far too easy to kill a player with a crit. Like, you roll well and you get a crit. You can, especially some of the squisher characters like wizards and sorcerers, you can just instantly kill them. No rolls or anything. You do enough damage to get to their negative hit point maximum. They're insta-dead. And at that low level, you're rolling a new character. No one is going to pay 1,000 gold to resurrect a level 1 wizard. So yeah, this hit point and stress mechanic is really, really interesting. Anything under your minor threshold does stress damage instead of hit point damage. And maxing out your stress is not bad. Maxing out your hit points, you die. And we'll talk about that in a couple seconds here, because the death mechanics are cool. But yeah, I mean, this damage threshold and hit points is a brilliant system. I would love to talk to the game designers to figure out where they came up with this system, because it's absolutely brilliant. I've never seen, like, if you look at something like Essence 20, they use small hit points as well. Like, you might start off, your character will probably start off with only like 2 or 3 hit points. And most damage only does 1 or 2 hit points. That's perfectly fine. This kind of combines the more traditional RPG of damage roll style hit points with the more simplistic minimalist hit point in a really interesting way. And I love that. And then stress, again, stress can lead to hit point loss. Stress can be used for your abilities. Stress can be used in a lot of different ways. So it's just an additional resource that you and your GM can kind of leverage to react to more interesting situations. You don't always have to take damage when you're dealing with a trap or doing something stupid. You can deal with stress. So yeah, really cool stuff there. And then they talk about action rolls and how those will work. I'm not going to go into the specifics, but it's roll 2d12. You're going to be adding something to it. You can burn hope to add one of your experiences, which is the equivalent of skills in this. And yeah. And so they use character tokens. Basically, when you roll, just so that you have a physical representation of anything that you are adding to the roll, you will put a character token down. So let's say you're making an agility roll and you have a +2 in agility. When you roll, you will also put 2 character tokens down to remind you it's supposed to add 2. If you're also using an experience that you also have 2, you would have 4 character tokens. So you would roll, and then you would count the character tokens and go, okay, that much. I think that in and of itself is probably more work than it really needs to be. When we talk about their version of initiative, character tokens are actually really useful. In this particular instance, I don't think it's that useful. I think it's much easier to just have a static modifier on your character sheet and just add the numbers, as opposed to having to put these character tokens on the table every single time you do stuff here, because yeah, that would get very, very annoying very, very quick. So yeah, and then it just talks about, critical success, success with hope, success with fear, all the different ways that you can do that. They talk about stories, consequences, basically telling you, hey, don't shy away from failure. Failure makes for more interesting stories. And then they give an example for an action roll where they show a failure with fear, a failure with hope, a success with fear, and a success with hope, and then a critical success of the exact same roll. And then they have special action rolls. So a trait roll is an action roll that specifically calls for a certain character trait to be used. Attack rolls we've already talked about. Unarmed combat rolls, they have special rolls of that. And then a spellcasting roll. All of those things are considered special action rolls. And then they also have tag team rolls. And then damage rolls. Calculating damage, damage without modifiers, damage with modifiers. Again, lots of examples of everything going there. Damage types and resistances. Direct damage, which is basically damage that doesn't require an attack roll. Then they talk about resistance and immunity. Then they have reaction rolls, which are effectively your saving throws. They talk about how those work. They talk about the evasion score, advantage and disadvantage. They finally describe what advantage and disadvantage is on page 111. We have no idea what advantage and disadvantage is before this point, but they've been talking about it incessantly all throughout the game. So again, put this chapter first. On the basics of advantage, disadvantage, it's a d6. On advantage, you roll a d6, add it to your score. Disadvantage, you roll a d6, subtract it from your score. They talk about the conditions. Currently, there are only 3 conditions: vulnerable, hidden, and restrained. I'm assuming the full version will have more than that. Then they talk about countdowns. Countdowns are actually really similar to, if you remember in Fabula Ultima, they had those things called clocks. But they're a specific kind of clock where the only thing that they do is they count down. Whereas in Fabula Ultima, you could have clocks that count down, you could have clocks that count up. It's one of my favorite things about Fabula Ultima is the clock system. Countdown is kind of similar to that. The other thing that annoys the hell out of me is they talk about countdowns, but they don't actually explain how they work, because you need to go to the GM section to be able to learn about that. Just... Anyway. Then you talk about maps, range, and movement. So you have melee, very close, close, far, and very far are the ranges. And again, and then they talk about gold and how they do it in that. This is something I also find kind of interesting. So they don't measure gold in gold pieces or anything. You measure gold in handfuls, bags, chests, and hoards and a fortune. And so they use, again, kind of similar to Open Legend, where your money is a little bit more abstract. Tiny stuff like tipping your waitress, you don't need to keep track of that. But if you're going to spend something, it might cost 2 handfuls of gold, or might cost 1 chest of gold. And so, again, it allows less focus on numbers and more focus on just kind of relative to what you think it should be, which I enjoy. Then you have downtime, which are basically your rests. You have short rest and long rest. Short rest is an hour. Long rest is 8 hours. And when you do a short and long rest, you can choose 2 of a number of options. For short rest, tend to wounds, you heal your hit points. Clear stress, you clear stress. And you roll, for both those on a short rest, you roll a d4 and restore that many hit point or stress. Repair armor. Armor is interesting in this, where each armor has a value, like you might have an armor of 5. And then you have, as part of your character, you have a number of armor points. And basically, you can burn an armor point to reduce the amount of damage you take by the value of your armor. And to get those armor points back, you have to repair them during a short or long rest. And if you don't need to do any of those, because you were in the back as a wizard and didn't take any stress or anything, you can prepare, which describe how you're preparing yourself for the path ahead and gain a hope. So you can just earn a hope. For long rests, you can still tend to wound, clear stress, repair armor, and prepare. But instead of just rolling a d4, you heal all your hit points or all your stress or all your armor slots. So short rest, you have a limited number. Long rest, you just do them all. And again, you get to choose 2 of 5 for long rest, because what thing you can also do on long rest is work on a project. Basically building more stuff or doing something that takes long time. They talk about projects and stuff like that. Then they talk about death. When you mark your last hit point, you must make a death move. So there's 3 different things that you can do. 1, you can embrace death and go out in a blaze of glory. You take 1 action at the GM's discretion, which becomes an automatic critical success, then cross through the veil of death. So, again, very similar to Fabula Ultima, you can just choose to sacrifice yourself and go off. And this is a choice you get to make. Second one, avoid death and face the consequences. You drop unconscious temporarily, work with the GM to describe how the situation gets much worse because of it. Then roll your fear die. If the value is equal to or under your level, take a scar. You may not take any actions while unconscious when you have any number of your marked hit points cleared by an ally, or on your party's next long rest, you return to consciousness. Now this seems kind of weird, because it effectively means that the higher your level, the more likely it is for you to get a scar. And scars are basically you mark a hit point, and you can't refill that hit point anymore. And if that eventually happens to all of your hit points, your character's dead, and you don't get to do anything. The last choice you can make is called Risk It All. Roll your duality dice. If hope is higher, you stay on your feet and clear an amount of hit points and or stress equal to the value of the hope die. Divide the hope die value up between these however you prefer. If your fear die is higher, you cross through the veil of death. If the duality dice are tied, you stay on your feet and clear all hit points and stress. So, you can choose to die and go out in a blaze of glory. You can choose to avoid death and just go unconscious, possibly get a scar. Or you can leave it up to chance. You roll your duality die. If hope is higher or they tie, not only do you not die, you regain some hit points and jump back into the fight. However, if your fear die is higher, you're dead. You don't get to go out in a blaze of glory. You don't get anything. You're just dead. I love the fact that there's a gamble mechanic as far as death is concerned. because some people are going to like the idea of just the gambling aspect of, hey, maybe I could do something really good here, as opposed to just having the choice of I either live or die. Other people, the paralysis of choice is a real thing. So other people are just going to be like, I don't want to have to choose between whether my character dies or is unconscious for the rest of the battle. I don't know if I want to deal with the scar thing and all that. I don't know what I want to do. I'm just going to roll for it. So I love that. And then they talk about the scars here. If you choose to avoid death, you might take a scar. If you do, permanently cross out one of your hope slots. Oh, it's hope, not scars or hit points. Permanently cross out one of your hope slots. You cannot use this slot to store hope anymore. When you put a scar in your last hope slot, it is time to end your character's journey. And then there is resurrect. They say it is possible to resurrect a dead character, though it will be though it will likely be a long, difficult, and costly process, and they likely won't return the same as they died. If a party decides to take this path upon a character's death, the GM will tell the players what it will take to make it happen. For more details on this, check this part of the GM section that I don't think they've written yet. There's also a one-time resurrection spell at level 10 for any class that includes the Splendor domain. Once this spell has been used, it will go into your vault permanently. So it's an ability that is a one and done for the lifetime of your character. So again, death in Daggerheart is a much bigger deal. The next part, they talk about combat and they talk about the action tracker. This is the thing that makes combat in Daggerheart so unique. Basically, the way that combat works, you don't roll initiative. What happens, the GM places the action tracker, which is just a card that says action tracker, puts it on the table. And then the players decide who wants to do something. Every time a PC makes an action roll, whether that is making an attack, getting information, whatever you're doing, anytime you make a roll, you put an action token on the action tracker. And they just keep going. What happens is as soon as one of the players rolls with fear, so whether you fail with fear or succeed with fear, once you roll with fear, the players stop taking their actions and the GM can take as many actions as there are action tokens, one after another. So basically the players, and this is another kind of gambling mechanic, the players will go, okay, well, I'm going to do this first, put an action token down. Well, then I'm going to do this, put an action token down. I'm going to do this. Oh, shoot, I rolled with fear. We resolve what they were doing. Now the GM gets to go, well, this monster's going to do this, I burn that. This monster's going to do this, I burn that. This monster's going to do this, and I burn that. So it's possible that you might rank up a lot of actions before you roll a fear, and then the GM gets to just take over and just start doing things. Another thing that happens, the GM has his fear pool. He can burn fear to get additional action tokens, or he can burn fear to just interrupt what's going on and immediately take an action if you guys just aren't rolling for fear and you're about to kind of trivialize the encounter. So, the action tracker, as far as like an initiative style thing, is really interesting. I don't know how much it's going to have to change between now and when the game goes live. It's definitely something that I need to actually see it in action in order to have an opinion other than the idea of that looks really interesting and I've never heard of an initiative quite like that. The more actions you take, the more actions the GM's going to be able to take repeatedly. So, yeah, it's interesting to say the least. And then they have a thing of players' best practices. Embrace the danger, use your resources, tell your story, discover your character. They talk about the leveling up system. Leveling up in and of itself is interesting. Basically, every time you level up, you have a list of advancements that you can take, and they break them into effectively, I think it's like 3 different tiers. Yeah. So you have 2 to 4, effectively. You have 5 to 7, and then you have 8 to 10. And each has their own list of things that you can take. Which, again, is interesting. It's and then every time you gain a level, you can choose a new domain card. And every level has their own sets of domain cards, so you can always take one from a lower level. So if you couldn't kind of choose between 2 of them and you get to like level 3 and none of the level 3 domain cards are really doing it for you, you can take another level 2 domain card when you get to level 3, stuff like that. So you're constantly gaining new abilities. You're kind of piecemeal increasing your character in general. And yeah, things like you can raise your damage threshold, so it's harder to kill you, or it's harder for you to take hit point damage. There's even a multi-classing option, which is interesting. It's remarkably similar to the 4th edition multi-classing, where specifically hybrid classing, where in 4th edition there was 2 different ways to multi-class. You could take a multi-class feat, which basically gave you access to a specific ability from a different class, and then allowed you to choose cards from that class. Or you could do what was called a hybrid class, where at character creation you would choose 2 classes, and instead of getting the full list of benefits of each class, you got these kind of truncated hybrid class versions of them. That's kind of what they have here, where when you multi-class, you can you choose another class and you get kind of a lesser version of their defining ability, and then can choose stuff from their domains in addition to yours, as far as I can tell. And yeah, they give an example of leveling up. They talk about equipment and the proficiency system that I've already talked about. They have primary and secondary weapons, which I'm not 100% certain I'm super fond of. But basically, your primary weapons are things like battle axe, warhammer, quarterstaff, short sword, and they also have magic weapons as well. Things like arcane gauntlets, or hand runes, or a returning blade. So kind of an interesting thing. And again, the thing that's cool about this is, wow, this is going to be a long video, folks. Sorry. I just looked and we're at 2 hours. The interesting thing about the weapons is there's no proficiency necessary to wield weapons. Any character can wield any weapon. The difference is going to be whether or not you're particularly good for that. Like a battle axe, the trait that it uses is strength. So if you have a low strength score, you're probably not going to want to use a battle axe. Whereas a dagger is a finesse, uses finesse for it, or a longsword uses agility. So that's really what's going to define. The same thing is true, like arcane gauntlets use strength. Returning blade uses finesse. A short staff uses instinct. So those are the things that are going to kind of limit you. And then certain weapons also have things like the rapier has a feature called light, which just gives you a +1 to your agility. Which, interesting thing about that, the rapier uses presence for its attack roll, but it gives a +1 to your agility. So I find that really interesting. And then you have, let me go to secondary weapons. Secondary weapons are things like shields, a parrying dagger, or whip. And this is something that annoys me. Dagger and short sword are both primary and secondary weapons. And depending on how you use them, like dagger, it has a feature if you use it as a secondary weapon, paired, +2 to primary weapon damage in melee. Or short sword is the same thing, is paired, +2 to primary weapon damage in melee. So both dagger and short sword you can use as a primary weapon. Whip, you can only use as a secondary weapon. Why would you do that to me? I want to build my super cool Castlevania ripoff character, and you're making me choose a secondary weapon versus a primary? That's just mean. But the feature for the whip is whip crack. Mark of stress. to scatter enemies in melee into close range. So basically, you can use an action to mark a strike and just go, and they back up a little bit. I think that's really cool. So yeah, they list a bunch of different kind of versions of them. They list different armors, leather, breastplate, chainmail, and full plate, and how those work. And again, you don't have proficiencies that require you to do things. It's just like full plate armor gives you a base score of 9. So anytime you burn an armor point to reduce damage, you're going to take 9 off of it. But it's very heavy, so it gives you a -2 to your evasion and a -1 to your agility, which is really interesting. So basically, full plate armor, you're actually easier to hit in because it lowers your evasion, and that's your defense stat. But when you are hit, you can burn the armor to reduce the amount of damage you take, possibly to 0. Like 9 points is a decent amount of defense. So that's really fascinating. And then they talk about magic versions of all the different armor and stuff like that. And then some other kind of item stuff that you might find, like gecko gloves. You can climb up vertical surfaces and across ceilings. Stuff like that. Consumables, other things. And then the final part of this section is a full example of play. So it's basically, starts on page 152, goes all the way to halfway down 158. So about 6 pages worth of text, just giving an example of an entire, like, part of a session. Like, this is probably, I don't know, maybe 5 to 10 minutes of a session, maybe 20. But it does some combat. Does it start in combat? Yeah, no. It starts in kind of an exploration encounter. It eventually gets into combat. And it's, again, a really, really great example of how the game is run. And then at the end of it, it says questions to consider for GMs. It's kind of does a what if. Okay, this is how it went that time, but these are the other ways it could have gone. These are questions you can ask as a GM that might have made it turn out differently. So I love the fact that in addition to giving a really good example, they also go, by the way, it could have gone this way, or these are other ways that you could have done it. Really, really effective training methods. So, yeah, moving on. There are only 5 parts in this, and part 5 doesn't exist currently, but this is a long video. I'm already starting to feel it. Part 3, Running an Adventure. So, this is effectively your intro to GMing chapter. This has your kind of generic GM advice, like core guidance, GM principles. Be a fan of the players and the PCs, fill the world with life, wonder, and danger, ask questions and incorporate answers, hold on gently, play to find out what happens. So this is all advice on how to run GMing. Then they have GMing best practices, or stuff that just advice on how to run games in general. They have some pitfalls to avoid. All of this is really, really good advice. And then core GM mechanics. They talk about the GM's die, where it talks about how you use a D20 instead of the 2D12 that the players use. They talk about making moves, which is basically when the GM kind of interferes in every thing. And they give examples on when and how to do that. They give some examples of GM moves, which is really good. They talk about fear and how that mechanic works as a game master. And kind of tips for how to use fear. And then attack rolls, the action tracker, reaction rolls, all the stuff on, this is all kind of stuff that will happen in almost every single session is what this, running at a adventure, advice for how to run things in the kind of small part. Then they give some example difficulties, things like for agility, if you wanted to climb something. Difficulty 5 would be scaling a high ladder. Difficulty 10 would be scaling a stone castle wall or a moderate incline. Difficulty 15 would scale a stone castle wall in the rain or a sharp mountain slope. Difficulty 20, scale a siege tower during a battle. Clamber up a massive foe, if you want to go full on Dragon's Dogma. 25, scale a sheer cliff or inverted wall with minuscule hand/footholds. And difficulty 30, scale a sheer cliff in a hurricane. Climb the back of a hostile dragon diving through a thunderstorm. So things like this is another thing that in 4th edition they had lists like this in a lot of different places where they would just give you a bunch of different kind of example difficulty classes. 5th edition they moved away from it a little bit because they wanted to put more authority in the GM, and I really don't like that. The only thing I'm less than thrilled about this is I do believe that there should be a level adjustment when you're giving difficulty classes, because technically, yes, scaling a high ladder for a first level character, you might run into an issue, but though probably not. A 5 is incredibly easy to roll in 2d12. Again, the further away from 11 you get on 2d12, or which one is it? I have to look. Further you get from 13 on a 2d12, the less likely you are to roll it. So a 5 is really low. You're generally, 5 has a 2.78% chance of rolling, a 4 is a 2%, 3 is a 1.39, and 2 is less than 1%. So if you add all of those up, to get a 5 or lower, you're looking at less than 5%. So normally on a d20, any roll you make is a 5% chance. On this, rolling a 5, 4, 3, or 2, you have a 5% chance of rolling those 4 numbers. And any one of those numbers is significantly less. So, yeah. However, when you get up to like a level 7 character, a difficulty 10 is going to be remarkably simple because they're going to have a bunch of bonuses. I don't know how true that's going to be here because it looks like the bonuses don't get nearly as crazy, even as they do in 5th edition. In 5th edition, the bonuses are not massive. So maybe this isn't really a big thing. But in 4th edition, they would actually give you a easy, medium, and hard per level. And that was really, really nice. I guess this one, maybe it's not as big a deal. But I always like these little things because, again, as a DM or a GM, when you're in the middle of something, your brain can just go out on you. And you can just forget what difficulty classes are for a moment. And having something like this that you can just reference really quickly is really nice. Then they talk about adversaries and how to read the stat blocks and everything. Stat blocks in and of themselves, like I said, really, really simple and easy to understand. Is this where they have the list of stuff? Yes, here they are. So, adversary types. As I mentioned before, this is the best part of D&D 4th edition. Combat design was so much fun, and they've brought back something similar. So these are the types that exist in Daggerheart as of right now. It doesn't mean that this is all of these are going to exist when it comes out, or that these are the only ones. These are the ones that are in the playtest right now. Bruiser, tough adversaries with powerful attacks. Horde, a horde represents a number of foes working in a group. Leader, adversaries that command and summon other adversaries. Minion, basic enemies that are easily dispatched but dangerous in numbers. Ranged, adversaries that attack from a distance. Skulker, adversaries that maneuver and exploit opportunities to ambush their opponents. Social, adversaries that are primarily interpersonal threats or challenges. Solo, designed to present a challenge to a whole party. Standard, rank and file adversaries. Support, enemies that enhance their allies and or disrupt their opponents. Ha! Guys, it's so good. I cannot tell you how much I miss encounter design from 4th edition. It was so much easier. It was so much more fun. Because you'd sit there, it's like, well, I definitely want to have a bruiser. Probably want to have at least one support, and maybe a couple ranged. And that was super fun and super simple to kind of create these really interesting, unique combat encounters. Whereas nowadays, you have to look at the entire stat block in 5th edition and figure out, okay, well, how do I want to use this? And most characters have both a melee and a ranged attack, and you have to kind of look at the character to figure out which one it's really designed to do and whether you want to focus on that or not. And then you have to figure out, well, do I want to use this one as my... And it's just complicated. This just makes it so much easier. So great. They have a system for scaling adversaries. There's another thing from 4th edition, is they had rules for how to take like a level 4 creature, which it was super simple. A standard creature in 4th edition was equal to a standard player of that level. So if you had 4 level 1 characters, if you gave them 4 level 1 regular creatures to fight against, it was generally going to be a relatively balanced encounter. It wasn't going to be super easy. It wasn't going to be super difficult. It was going to be kind of in the middle. And so they had rules about how you could level up creatures or level them down to make it easier to kind of customize the things. And it was great. So they have scaling in here. They have an entire thing where they talk about how to take an assassin poisoner and make it a lower level or a higher level. And it's just great. So good. And then they talk about countdowns and how to use those. Another thing really, really useful. Gold. They talk about different GMing styles. And then some optional mechanics. Fate rolls, falling, throwing damage, moving and fighting underwater, and character versus character stuff, so PvP stuff. And then they have an entire section on Session Zeros. I've talked about this ad nauseum, but I do not believe Session Zero is nearly as essential as everyone makes it out to be. It's a very useful tool. It is not essential. You can run perfectly great games without ever having a Session Zero, and no one will have an RPG horror story if you understand how to communicate like adults. But it is nice to have a little guide, especially since, again, as I mentioned before, there are going to be a lot of people that pick up Daggerheart that have never played an RPG before. You can say Session Zero a million times, and they will have no idea what that means. So having a guide on how it works is very useful for new players. And they even have a Session Zero breakdown. In all the Session Zeros I have ever run, I have never run a 4-hour Session Zero. But they do show how to run a 4-hour Session Zero. And part of that is character creation, which I guess if you wanted to all build your characters together as a collaborative process, you might be able to pull off a 4-hour long Session Zero. Most of my Session Zeros that I have run have been between 1 and 2 hours, because you really don't need that much time to be able to talk with everyone, kind of define what the campaign's about, get any lines and veils that you want out, and give them character creation ideas. So, yeah. And then they give some tips on session prep, building battles, choosing adversaries, stuff like that. And then specifically on running a session. You know, all stuff really useful, mostly generic GM advice with a few things peppered in there specifically for Daggerheart. But a really great chapter in general for new GMs. And returning GMs as well. Like, there's still a lot of good information. It's something that I see this far too often. People that have been game mastering for a long time will completely skip the game master or the how to run a session section in an RPG because they're like, well, I'm a wonderful game master. None of this is useful to me because I know it all already. You don't. Again, I have thousands of hours of game mastering under my belt. I'm a platinum bestseller in the DM's Guild. I have reviewed tons of different RPGs and the things like that. I have a significant amount of experience and knowledge on being a GM. And then I also have a degree in management, which half of GM is understanding management. So I am one of the more knowledgeable GMs currently looking at this. And I learned new things from it. So I don't care if you played with Gary Gygax himself. It's never a bad idea to at least skim through. A lot of this information I already know. But there's always going to be new stuff that you're going to find. Even in the generic, this is how you GM section, there's going to be good stuff in there. So never think that you are such a good GM that you can just skip this section entirely. And then just more stuff. Impromptu NPCs and enemies if you need to just make stuff up off off the top of your head. Impromptu attack modifiers, impromptu damage, scaling damage, stuff like that. Just a lot of stuff that if when your players go into a shop and piss off the bully that's in there that you weren't expecting them to piss off, and one of them like draws their weapon against them, you're like, shit, I don't have a stat block for this. They have stuff in here for that. Then they talk about character death and how to kind of deal with that. And then a specific section on running a one-shot, which is basically a fill-in-the-blank for you to come up with a quick kind of paragraph summary of what your one-shot is supposed to be. And yeah, so really simple, really easy. And that's the end of that. Moving on. Part 4. Running a campaign. So this, again, the running an adventure was much more about, this is stuff that you're going to be using in a particular session. Running a campaign is going to be a lot more about world building, GM prep, and stuff like that for a much larger thing. Talk about things like building a map, filling space, leaving blanks, which is basically know where to kind of put things in so there's enough structure there for the players to be able to have something to cling on to, but leave blank parts so that the players can fill those in with their own ideas. It's something that I think Fabula Ultimate is really, really well. The idea that when you're building the world, part of your session 0 is actually physically building the world. And what they recommend you do is you start with a map, and they give you 2 different maps as part of the core book, or you could just make your own map if you want to. But you start off with a physical map. That's the filling space. You start with a map, and then leaving blanks. There's no cities, there's no nothing written on the map. And so yeah, understanding that idea of you need to give them some structure, because if you just give them a blank area and go, okay, so let's create a world, they're going to get choice paralysis. You need to give them something to cling on to, and then allow them to be creative. So, good advice again. Incorporating player backstories, basically how you can kind of write adventures and things like that that are going to incorporate parts of backstories. And they give examples like Barnabas, a lowborn Simia wizard. And so they talk about, like, obsessed with finding relics, treasures, and bones of legendary creatures. He thinks these should be used for their given purpose, not stashed away into musicians. Wants to gather as much knowledge as he can in his lifetime. Uses bone runes to cast magic. So it's basically kind of describing the different stuff about there. And then they have an entire section that's like, okay, so what parts of the backstories are related? What can I kind of link together? One of the things that I do a lot in my campaigns is all the players build their backstories on their own for the most part. I think I've had one time where players like, can we be siblings? I'm like, yeah, sure, it's perfectly fine. So they had shared backstories. But for the most part, everyone makes their backstories separately, and then they get them to me. Then I start looking for common themes. And generally, when I do a character focus, I try to make it a character focus of there's one person that it's primarily dealing with something from their backstory, but also we're going to pull in this other part of this other character. So you have 2 characters that have a link to this, that have to kind of decide which is going to become more important. And it just makes the party more cohesive. Yeah, and then they talk about playing an arc. They talk about the 3-act structure. If anyone is unaware, if you ever study writing, you will learn about, depending on which kind of writing that you are learning, you will more likely than not learn about the 3-act structure, which is the most common writing thing ever. If you go into playwriting, you may learn about the 2-act structure because it's really, really, it's a really common form of writing specifically for stage plays. And if you go into television writing, you might learn about either the 4 or the 5-act structure. Which is, again, 4 and 5-act are almost exclusively, like 5-act I believe is almost exclusively used in television because the acts all end at commercial breaks. The 4-act structure tends to be a little bit more common in like hour-long drama. And then the 3-act structure is just everybody uses the 3-act structure. So they talk about the 3-act writing structure here, which is not a bad structure. And they kind of show you how you could split it up into multiple sessions so that you can run character arcs. If you've watched any of Critical Role, which if you're watching this, I'm going to assume you have. But if you've watched anything for Critical Role, they have arcs. And they're generally like the arc structure they talk about here. Session 1 is Act 1. Session 2 and 3 is Act 2. Session 4 is Act 3. So they have a gameplay arc that lasts 4 sessions. I think the shortest arc in Campaign 1 was like 12 sessions long. And some of the longer arcs were like 30 or 40 sessions long when you talk about Critical Role. So depending on how long a campaign, Daggerheart is a significantly shorter game than D&D is ever going to be. Because again, Daggerheart has 10 levels, D&D has 20, and D&D in and of itself is just a longer experience. So yeah, I could definitely see arcs in Daggerheart being a little bit shorter, but it's good advice nonetheless. You really should understand how the 3-act writing structure works because it shows up everywhere. Most movies use a 3-act structure. A lot of TV shows use a 3-act structure. Most books are written in a 3 or 4 act structure. Technically, the 5-act structure shows up in novels a little bit more often. If you ever learned they used to call it mount plot. We had the introduction, what was it? Introduction, something, rising action, climax, falling action. Yeah, it was an introduction, rising action, climax, falling action, resolution, or the denouement. That's a 5-act structure. So you do see that in novels and things like that. 3-act structures, like I said, a lot more common in most entertainment that we see. So yeah, they just give examples of how to write in that particular thing. And then they have a leveling up section. And it doesn't look like they use experience points. It looks effectively, they go, when your party reaches the end of an arc, that's usually a good time to have them level up their characters. All players should level up at the same time, following the level up guide specific to their class. If you're running a short campaign, you may instead have the party level up every other session instead, or whatever cadence feels appropriate to campaign length. So effectively, leveling in Daggerheart is milestone. They don't offer an experience points leveling system, which I agree with. Experience leveling is just not fun. It's great for video games. It's not great for tabletop RPGs, and it never really has been. And then they have a location section, which is basically they give 4 example locations, 1 for each tier. So you have tier 0, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. And each one just gives you an example of the location itself. It gives an example of some sub-locations, some settlements. Basically, this is a map section or a... can't remember the word. Starts with the C. Anyway, this is a map section without a map. So it just gives you like the Sablewood, Rime of the Colossi, Gendalia, and the Kinnikozin Jags, which is a mountain, I'm assuming. And so yeah, it'll give you some examples of locations in there, some examples of some adventure hooks or things that might happen in that section. And then it also gives some example stat blocks of monsters that might get there. And each one is geared towards a particular tier. So tier 0 is for level 1, tier 1 is for levels 2 to 4, tier 2 is 5 to 7, tier 3 is 8 to 10. So Sablewood would be your starting adventure, Rime of the Colossi would be for your low-level characters, Gendalia would be mid-tier characters, and then I'm not going to say the name again, but the Mountain Place is for your high-level characters. And they have some stuff about themes, and yeah, they go through each one of these things. They have landmarks, settlements, factions that exist in there, and things that you might want to deal with. Then some NPCs, some story hooks, stuff like that. And they do that for each different thing. Along with some adversaries. Like in Sablewood, the adversaries, they have a bullfrog, Strixwolf, alligator, and then we go to the next section. So 3 things like that. And then after all that, I'm going to go part 4. After the different locations, they have an adversaries reference, which is effectively your monster manual here. And they have them arranged by tiers. So you have your tier 0 stuff, which has the most number of creatures in there. You have your tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. So again, everything that you need to be able to run. They give a quick refresher on some of the different things that happen, some of the different descriptors in there, and then you just have a bunch of character stat blocks. And again, really simple to understand how they run. They've already explained this a couple different times on how it works. And yeah, a nice sized monster manual. The actual stat blocks start on page 321, and then they go all the way to 375. So it's a pretty decent sized monster manual. And because there's no art, and there's really not a whole lot of description of them either. Like, this is not like your D&D 5th edition monster manual. Each one has a little paragraph or so of information about it. These are just stat blocks. I'm certain the full version will actually have descriptions and will be much more similar to a traditional monster manual. But because of that, this is just information that you can use. So yeah, that what was it, like 50 some odd pages of stuff? There's a lot there, which is very nice. And that's the end of that. So moving on. Part 5. It's not here yet. Part 5 doesn't exist, but what it's going to have: a homebrew guide, a balance guide, custom domain cards, custom adversaries, custom equipment, and card templates. So this is all basically the homebrew section, and the homebrew section doesn't exist right now, which is not a bad thing. We don't have the game system built yet. We don't really need to be giving people tips on how to homebrew a system that doesn't exist yet. Technically we have a system here, but it's going to be going through changes. One of which is, I hope they put part 2 in the place of part 1. But part 5 just doesn't exist yet, which is, again, perfectly fine. And then at the very end, they have an appendix that doesn't exist. They have important terms, character sheets, character guides, ancestry deck, community deck, subclass deck, domain decks, index. None of those things are in the playtest manuscript. So yeah, that's the end of it. So moving on to final thoughts. Overall, Daggerheart has impressed me so much. The hit point and damage threshold system is ingenious. The dual, what do they call it again? The dual dice system. I can't remember what it's called anymore. Duality dice system is interesting, and I think it's really, it has a lot of potential. I'm going to have to actually run some games and play some games in this before I can give you a 100% opinion on that particular aspect. I think it has a lot of potential in it. The character classes in and of themselves, I think, are interesting. There's no monk, so the game is an abject fail and should burn. No. They're limited right now because, again, this is still a playtest. When the full thing comes out, I'm expecting them to probably have more options than are currently available right now. Maybe even a new class or something. But there's a lot here that can be expanded upon, which is an essential part of creating a tabletop RPG. If we look at Open Legend is a fantastic tabletop RPG that instantly died. Now, that was because of really bad management, but there has never been an Open Legend supplement that has been sent out or anything like that because it just was never made. Every single tabletop RPG, after it's released, it needs to have supplements if you want it to continue existing. Releasing some kind of SRD is at least in this day and age, is essential if you want your RPG to create a fan base, because it will allow your players to create their own supplements. And if you create a way for them to be able to make money off of it, it will be significantly more successful. It's one of the reasons why D&D is still the most popular RPG, because way back in 3rd edition, they created a system that allowed other people to create content for them and sell it. And that was really essential for it to keeping the market. It's one of the reasons why 4th edition undersold the way that it did. It still sold better than 3rd edition. Anyone that tells you it's less popular than 3rd edition is lying to you. But the SRD for 4th edition was significantly more limited and significantly more confusing. And so there really aren't third-party products for 4th edition. There's not many. 5th edition, they went back, and it's massively popular. So I believe they've mentioned like there are mentions on the website of them having a thing that's kind of like the SRD. I don't know what it is, but yeah. Overall, this system, it throws away a lot of tropes that have existed in RPGs for years that simply exist there because they've always been there. Things like weapon proficiencies. You don't need them. It doesn't change how the game is played in any way, shape, or form. It just makes it more difficult to create unique characters. There are no weapon proficiencies in this. Anyone can use anything as long as they have the stats in the right place. And that makes this an incredibly interesting, cool thing. The parts 3 and 4 are remarkably well written. They've got lots of great advice for new GMs. They've got lots of great advice for very experienced GMs like me. And part 4 has a lot of tools that you can use to create your own adventures and things like that. I have not looked through I've not looked through the quick start guide, which is basically just your introductory adventure, because it's a separate file. You get it, like I downloaded it all from DriveThruRPG because I wanted the PDFs of everything. But I got everything. I have every single card, and they look amazing. The artwork's great on the cards. So there's lots of really, really good, great stuff here. I just haven't had a chance to go through all of it. But the core playtest manuscript impressed the hell out of me. I am so excited to start playing this game. And this early version of it is in a better place than the Power Rangers RPG was when it launched. This shows so much work has gone into this. You can't, like, this is the first open playtest that they had. If you look at the 1D&D playtest that they've been doing for, 2 or 3 years now, you have never been able to run a 1D&D campaign because none of the playtest materials have ever been enough to actually run a game. It's all little things and little changes. If you remember the old D&D Next stuff, a lot of times you didn't really have the ability to run a campaign in D&D Next. You barely had like the start of each class. This gives you everything you need. I could run an entire Daggerheart campaign from level 1 all the way up to level 10 with just the stuff that exists in this book. I've never seen that on a public playtest before. And I think that goes to just how confident they are in the product that they've created. They've created a phenomenally amazing product right here. And I cannot wait to see how they react to feedback. Like I said, as soon as, I may not do it tonight because I'm exhausted after recording an almost 3-hour-long video. But the first thing I'm going to do is tell them, take part 2 and put it in part 1's place, because that's how it needs to go. And if they listen to me, I will be very, very happy. If I can get other people to give that same advice, like if you're watching this video, go to the Daggerheart website, fill out the survey, and just tell them, put part 2 in part 1's place. Switch part 2 and part 1. Teach people how to play the game. before you give them character creation options. Otherwise, the character creation options are just gobbledygook. Please, for the love of everything that is holy, everybody just spam them with this. Let's see if we can get them to change. Because again, the reason everybody does this is because D&D does it, and D&D has been doing it wrong for 50 years. Anyways, I'm excited about this. I can't wait to create my first character in it. I can't wait to run my first game in it. I will definitely be running a session of this sometime. I don't know when. I don't know who's going to play with me. I don't know if I'm going to replace one of my Wednesday night games with it, or I'm going to do it on another night. I have no idea, but I am 100% going to run this game before it gets published. So yeah. For anyone that stayed through this entire thing, thank you so much. But that is going to be all for me today. As always, remember to like the video, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell icon to turn notifications on in the comments down below. Either tell me about the coolest thing that you found in Daggerheart, or tell me what your first character is going to be. Give me ancestry. What are they again? What is it? Heritage. Screw you. Yeah, give me ancestry, community, and class. And maybe even put your subclass in there. But I want to hear all that stuff in the comments down below. Otherwise, again, it is all for me today. I will see you guys in the next time. All right? Bye-bye.